Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Cyber Pulse. I'm your host, Sheikh Al-Thani, and today we're discussing a topic that has caught the attention of the cybersecurity community over the past few months, I'd say. We're gonna discuss the topic of anthropic mythos. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but I hope I am. Many people have described mythos as one of the biggest developments we've seen in AI for cybersecurity in particular. Others believe we're only scratching the surface of what it could mean for vulnerability research, application security, and even the future of cyber defense. To help us understand what Mythos is, why everyone is talking about it, and what it could mean for our industry, I'm joined by Fernando. I'll give him a chance to introduce himself, but he has a lot of experience in the cybersecurity domain and he works in Anomaly. He's a very interesting person with a very interesting background, so we'll dive right into it. Fernando, before we move forward with today's conversation, is there a chance you can introduce yourself to the audience and let them know a little bit about yourself?
Of course. Firstly, thank you for having me on this part of this conversation. My name is Fernando Maimi, and I am the Vice President of Professional Services and Training at Anomaly. But before that, I've been all over the place. I've served in the U.S. Army for a long time. Most of my career there was spent in and around cyberspace operations. I also did some research work for organizations like DARPA and the U.S. Office of Naval Research, all of it focused at the intersection of cyberspace operations and artificial intelligence of various flavors. And from there, I went to IronNet, where I was a CISO, among many other roles, and had a hand in applying collective defense principles around the globe. And that brought me over to Anomaly, where I am leading a team that ensures that the work that happens at the intersection of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence is grounded in good data, good intelligence, and good oversight over agents that are operating on our behalf.
Interesting background. I think you did a little bit of everything, which is quite interesting, to be honest. So since we're talking about AI and Mythos today, for someone hearing about Mythos for the first time, what is it? Can you introduce it to the audience?
Sure. Think of it as a new flavor or a new variant of a product that's already in existence. Anthropic, as do many other AI providers, releases a variety of models, of versions of their product that are tailored to specific applications. In the case of Anthropic, they have a model called Haiku, which is focused on speed and minimizing cost. So if you want to do something routine or quick, you use Haiku and you save some money. They have Sonnet, which is a more balance between speed and cost, and then Opus, which gives you the most capability up until now. And now they have the Mythos class, which despite the publicity that it has gotten over the last several months was not particularly intended, it seems, to do cybersecurity work per se. It was just a variant tailored for better coding that required long chains of thought in the tool.
Was it built to truly understand the command that was given to it and then answer to that command, or was it built to simplify things for people who are working in the cybersecurity field? Because there is a big debate when it comes to that. So which one is it when it comes to how you view this thing?
Well, I would start with a disclaimer that nobody really knows except for the people who actually built it inside of Anthropic and who were there at the very beginning of the development. It does appear from everything we know about the tool that's in the public domain that the intent here was twofold. The first one was for the agent to forget less, and the second one was for the agent to operate independently in a more reliable way. So let me unpack those real quick. The first one, anybody who's used an AI chatbot like Claude or OpenAI, ChatGPT, has had a long enough conversation with the bot, sooner or later will experience this point where either the conversation comes to an abrupt halt, or the bot starts to compress its memory or forget some things that happened early in the conversation. And it has to be reminded of that. And that has a lot to do with the context window of the agent. So in order to save costs, the tool providers will try to keep the context window big enough to do the things we want it to do, but small enough to save costs on the back end so that the price is less. So that forgetfulness is due in large measure to the context window of the agent. In the case of Mythos, that context window appears to be significantly larger. And by some accounts, it's in the millions of tokens. Of course, we don't know the exact number, but that's what's being really debated, I guess, in the open sources. And then the second piece of that is the ability for the agent to operate independently. It gets complicated real quick, but I'll give you an example. When an agent uses a tool, like calls an API for something or leverages, one of the tools that are built into your system, and that tool returns an error, then what does the agent do with that? And Mythos is designed to recover more gracefully, to use the tools more consistently across a very long conversation. So the emphasis here is on tasks that are very complex, that require it to try different alternatives over time without losing track of the original intent, which is a really long way to get back to the original question you asked. And it is intended to do what we wanted to do from the beginning without forgetting what that thing was in a very, very long effort.
Interesting. So it was built with, in simple terms, it seems like it was built with a better memory. So it can remember the original task that someone requested, and it will try its best to get that task done, correct?
Exactly. Particularly when that task requires it to try different things. And if those things fail, to try something different. And this happens over a long period of time.
So it won't count ethical things when it comes to that, or will it be able to tell the difference between what's ethical and what's not?
That is a feature that is built in through the use of guardrails. And it gets complicated because AI doesn't really have ethics. It is, at the end of the day, these fancy agents, all they're doing is they're trying to predict the next token, think of it as a word, in a sequence of tokens that it's returning to you as its output. So there's really no ethics in there. The ethics get injected in two ways, typically. The first one is in the training data. For example, if you feed an LLM, or large language model, if you feed it training data that is biased in some way, that is, it's not fair to a particular group of people, or that it tends to default to actions that are not really ethical, then the agent is likelier to return outputs that are unethical or biased or unfair. So the training data cleanliness is very important. The second place where the ethical constraints come into play is in the use of guardrails. And these are, think of them as rules that the developers of the agent put in place to limit the things that it can do. For example, you don't want an agent, in this case, to develop malicious software. So that's where Fable comes in. The Fable variant of the Mythos class of models has guardrails that prevent you from developing malware.
Interesting perspective. I never thought that it was developed that way. So you're telling me this guard can understand certain given commands?
So the guardrails are rules that humans add to the system. For example, if I ask the system to do something bad, think, teach me how to make a bomb or create malware for me, or teach me how to hurt myself or hurt others, then there will be a rule that somebody writes, and the agent may actually, in fact, produce a result. Hopefully we catch it before that. But then before that result is shared with the user, that output is compared to a set number of rules. And those rules, one of them will say, are you trying to do any of these things that we have determined are bad? If the answer is yes, then we can't answer that question. And most agents put this guardrail at the front end so that it doesn't waste a lot of computing. But even as the process continues, there are places to insert the guardrails in between or even at the end of the process.
Interesting. So the guardrail is what's controlling the output, if it will be shared or not based on the intent. If it understood the intent, it will stop it if the intent is bad, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, interesting. I never thought of AI like that, but this is very serious.
It is serious because it is very difficult to predict all the different ways in which somebody can abuse a tool like this. Like maybe a rule as part of my guardrails that says, don't create malware for your users. And I try it and I ask it, hey, create malware for me. And it says, no, that matches the rule. I can't do that. It says, well, teach me how a hacker would create malware. And then it's a very crude example, but that may, if the guardrail is not properly written, allow the agent to then go ahead and explain to me how that would happen. In effect, answering the question that I originally asked, but was not allowed. So one of the things that malicious users of these agents do is explore the limits of the guardrails and try to get around them. And this is why every now and then you hear a story about one of these products that did something that shouldn't have happened. And when you dig into it, you find out that it took somebody a lot of clever misuse of the application to get around the guardrails.
But this is very interesting, because it's taking a person who's very persistent to break it in terms to find an output, injecting different things to it so that you can test it out.
Exactly. And then it gets a little bit worse because the guardrails are put by the product developer, but there are LLMs available that have no guardrails. And these are commonly traded in the dark web. Yeah. So not every LLM has this security feature built in.
So not every LLM has security as a first priority. Some of them are built to break this.
Exactly.
Okay, what makes Mythos different from the AI models we've already been using? Is it smarter or is it simply better at cybersecurity tasks?
That's a really hard question. I mean, how do you define smartness in the first place, right? It is better than other models at a particular set of tasks. Before I circle back to answering your broader question, I want to take a little detour and explain what that looks like. When you're trying to find a vulnerability, it's not enough to find a defect in the software. That part is, or can be, significantly simpler. What you're trying to do is you're trying to find a defect in the software that allows me or an adversary to do something unintended, something that I should not be able to do, such as execute a remote command. So what the tool has to do, or what any person who's looking for vulnerabilities and to build exploits against those vulnerabilities would have to do, is to study the code and then try to break it. Try one approach, and that didn't work. Let me try a different approach. Oh, that one worked. And I get a step closer to my goal, but I still haven't been able to do my ultimate objective against that software. So I have to repeat this process time and time again. And each time I repeat it, I get one step closer to breaking the software in a meaningful way, in a way that I can use to do something malicious against it. But it takes a lot of trial and error across a lot of steps. Now, going back to my earlier statements about what makes Mythos different, Mythos has a longer context window, which means that it will remember for a longer time what it has done before, the interactions it's had with tools, the prompts it has received from the human user, etc. So this allows this agent to go way deeper in this process of trial and error in detecting an exploitable vulnerability. The second thing that makes Mythos appear to be smarter or better suited for this task is the use of the training data itself. Anthropic used a training data set that focused on chain of thought reasoning. So it is likelier to come up with good solutions that require a lot of deep thought around a complex task. So is it smarter at cybersecurity? Yes, in terms of vulnerability detection and exploit development, precisely because of what I described. But it also makes it better at other tasks that are not as dramatic or newsworthy, such as writing complex code with minimal or with less errors and bugs. It wasn't necessarily built for that use, which has garnered so much attention. Now, circling back to answering your question more broadly, is it smarter? There are a number of what we call benchmark tests. These are tests that different organizations have developed to compare multiple models against each other. For example, there's this thing called CyberGem and CyberBench and a bunch of others. So if you look at the performance of Mythos compared to other models, it's not really that far ahead of the pack. It may be, 1 or 2% points better across the board. But keep in mind that these benchmarks are intended to be applied to a very, very large set of use cases, not the particular use case that has garnered so much attention, which is the vulnerability discovery and exploit development. So are other models as smart as Mythos? Possibly in some areas, actually definitely in some areas. We're also finding that the different models are roughly equivalent across the board. And, one gets ahead a little bit, but then somebody else overcomes it. And as a point of comparison, they did a test with ChatGPT 5.5, I should say GPT 5.5. It is not as fast at exploit development as Mythos, but it is significantly cheaper at doing it. So if you're a little bit more patient, you can pretty much do the same thing with GPT 5.5.
So it depends on someone's patience level when it comes to expressing certain things, I guess.
But this concept of speed is important because if I'm willing to pay the extra cost to use a model like Mythos that requires significant resources, and obviously it's going to be more expensive. But if I'm willing to do that, and I'm an attacker and you're a defender, and you're not willing to do that, and your speed is significantly less than mine, then I have an edge over you. It doesn't mean I'm going to win necessarily, but it does give me an advantage over you.
But then this is never a fair game because whenever a technology is developed, it's being utilized heavily by both ends. It just depends on who's smarter at it and who used it first.
Exactly.
It's interesting. You mentioned vulnerability management, and I think Mythos, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, I think Mythos gained a lot of attention when it comes to that. So how good is it when it comes at discovering vulnerabilities compared to traditional tools?
It discovers a lot more vulnerabilities a lot quicker than other tools. That much we are pretty sure is true. But there's a lot of technical detail that matters in that conversation. And I'm going to touch lightly on a handful of things.
Sure.
One of the first numbers that were released to the press after the Mythos preview, or Mythos, I keep using both pronunciations interchangeably. But after the Mythos preview, which involved something like 200 companies by various counts, was that they found 23,000 vulnerabilities. And that was impressive. Like, these are big companies like Microsoft and Google and others, big companies that have very, very good resources to produce secure code and to ensure that it stays secure. 23,000. However, only something like 1,700 of those were verified by humans. And of those, only 75 were confirmed fakes. So I mentioned these numbers to show what the process is for vulnerability discovery and patching. First, you have to find a vulnerability. And you can find a whole bunch of these because not every vulnerability will be exploitable. A vulnerability is a code defect, yes. And that code defect will cause the software to do something unintended. But that unintended thing, it could be to add a 1 instead of a 2 to a particular equation, that calculation. So discovery is important, but not every vulnerability that is covered is something that we need to pay attention to. We can drown in a sea of noise if we're not careful here. So we have to verify that these vulnerabilities are actually exploitable. They're meaningful. And in this particular case, we have partial visibility, but it looks like it was an order of magnitude less vulnerabilities that were actually human verified as exploitable. And then once you find a vulnerability that's exploitable, you have to ask yourself, is this in a place that an adversary could get to? Let me give you an example. It's sort of a silly example, but if you have a firewall in front of your systems, and that firewall only allows traffic over to your web browser over port 80 or 443, and that's all the information that can get, all the network traffic can get in. And then several layers in, then you have a system that has a vulnerability that is not exposed to the network. So nothing significant is going to get into your network from the outside to begin with. And then to complicate matters, then this service that's quote unquote vulnerable is not even connected to that network in the first place. Is that vulnerability exploitable? Well, not really, because of where it sits. And that gets really hard. The context matters. And then finally, fixing the vulnerability may not be a simple process. And I'll give you an example. If you have a vulnerability in a medical application, a lot of countries like my own, the US, has rules in place where you cannot, if you modify the software in a certain class of medical products, then you cannot use that product unless it gets recertified by the Food and Drug Administration. So fixing the vulnerability itself is a major obstacle. So we have these obstacles along the way. And then finally, the point of this line of reasoning is that we have to look at vulnerability management as a whole program, not just the one tool that's going to bombard us with vulnerabilities that may or may not be exploitable.
It's interesting that you explained it that way, because a lot of people were fixated on the thought that Mythos is very brilliant or very smart at discovering vulnerabilities, but you mentioned a very critical part, which is human verification. So when humans were involved in verifying this, they saw a drastic change when it comes to what's vulnerable and what's not. So thank you for sharing that, because a lot of people just believed the given number that was marketed and that was it. But as you explained, patching is a life cycle or a process of itself. Can you give me more examples or more details when it comes to that? Because a lot of people take this for granted. They'll focus on identifying the vulnerability, but not on where is it placed and not on the whole life cycle. They'll just focus on discovering it, but then the patching process, not everyone would want to dig deeper into that. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's so much to unpack here. I don't think an hour or 2 or 3 would be enough. But vulnerability management is a tricky thing. Back when I was a CISO, this was one of the areas that I devoted significant attention to, because it is important to get it right. If you have a large enough code base, if you have a large enough project that you're developing, that you're selling to the community, and most enterprise-grade products are really, really big, then you're going to have vulnerabilities in there. You're going to have hundreds, perhaps even thousands of vulnerabilities, or tens of thousands, but you can't attempt to fix them all, because not all of them are going to be worthy of the effort required. And I'll give you an example. There was a vulnerability in a product that I was involved with years ago. And the vulnerability existed because there was a library that was imported. And a lot of times when we build software, we import libraries, we reuse libraries that somebody else has written. The library is just a collection of code that somebody else has written. But most commercial grade products incorporate a whole bunch of open source libraries in them to save them time and reduce the cost of development. So that particular library included a function that was vulnerable. It had a critical vulnerability in it. But the problem is that function was never called anywhere else in the platform. There were other functions that were part of that library that were being called, but that particular function was never called. So do I need to re-architect my entire application to avoid use of this vulnerable library at a cost that would be exorbitant? Or do I just put a safeguard in place to make sure that function is never called? And now I have a critical vulnerability that lives in my code, but it's just unreachable. There is a mitigating control in place that will prevent an adversary from exploiting it. Does that make sense?
In a way, yes. Because you're kind of telling me structure is very important when it comes to identifying vulnerabilities. So, and stating if they are worth being patched or not. Structure of where it's placed, how it's used, and all of that. It kind of reverts us back to the basics of understanding the network flow and if things are segmented properly or not.
Well, yes, and actually it's even more than that. The problem set is broader, because what I'm describing really, that you have well-named structured, you can think of it in broader terms as context.
Yes.
What is the context of the vulnerability? And context also includes adversarial access and adversarial intent. Is this a thing, a vulnerability, that an adversary could, number one, get to, but number two, want to get to? And that really depends on the intent of the adversary. So So this is where it's not just understanding the data that you have, the configuration of your network, of your systems, the software inside of your systems. You also need to understand who is touching it. What are the identities in your organization, both human identities and non-human identities, because there may be agents that interact with that software as well. And then you also have to understand the adversary. If a vulnerability exists in my system, and it's not particularly concerning to me. So the risk scoring of that vulnerability, according to my own policy, I have 30 days to fix it. Okay, so I can put it in the project plan and fix it in 30 days. But if I learn that there's an adversary that's actively exploiting that vulnerability, especially if it's in my region of the world or in my sector, then I'm going to bump that up. I'm going to treat that as an emergency. I have to patch it because it's being exploited in the wild. So this awareness of what happens outside of our companies is just as important in terms of prioritizing risks.
Interesting perspective. Yes, I agree when it comes to that. As you said, context is very important and this will drive certain decisions. Do you think organizations are ready to deal with AI finding vulnerabilities at this speed?
That really depends on the organization, to be honest with you. This vulnerability management program that we have been dancing around in our conversation is the one that determines whether organizations are ready for this dramatic increase in speed. And that's really what we're talking about. The speed at which these vulnerabilities are being identified. So going back to a good vulnerability management program, it all starts with understanding what you have. So asset inventory is important. Software composition is important. You have to know how the software is built. You have to know how your organization is architected, how it's put together. And of course, you have to understand how users interact, how identities more broadly, both human and non-human, interact with those resources. Once you understand your internal context, then you also have to understand the external one, which is where the adversary comes in, where network access comes in, and other kinds of access as well. So a good vulnerability management program starts with understanding your assets, with effectively searching for vulnerabilities in the assets you own, but also being aware of vulnerabilities that are being discovered elsewhere that would inform that internal search. And then you have to figure out what is the prioritization for these vulnerabilities, which ones will get fixed in what time frame, and you have to understand how the outside actions of adversaries or potential adversaries impact that risk calculus that you're conducting. So you have to look across the board, and you have to ensure that both your development teams, your security operations teams, and your business operations teams are all aligned. So you need a multifunctional approach to vulnerability management. If you have a well-functioning vulnerability management program in place, and you are applying artificial intelligence where you are allowed to, and I know this gets a little tricky because of regulations and data sovereignty and things like that, but if you are applying the right tools in the right places and you're ensuring that your program is both efficient and effective, then you'll be in good shape. This is not going to ruin your day, most likely. But if you're already struggling with vulnerability management, if you don't have a good program, if it's not multifunctional, if you don't have a good handle on what your assets are, then you're going to struggle, and this is probably going to hurt you.
Interesting. So you're kind of telling me it depends on the entity itself and how it operates, and through it, this entity will be able to determine its scope when it comes to this particular thing.
Exactly. In fairness, most organizations are already struggling with the volume of vulnerabilities that they have to track. So this is another case for leveraging artificial intelligence where possible to help with that, with managing the volume of existing vulnerabilities before things like Mythos come into play. And also another point that's worth making is that this is not going to hit everybody equally. If the organization is well resourced, then they're going to be able to deal with more volume. But if you have a smaller team, and here when I talk about smaller teams, it's important to point out the open source software teams. They typically tend to be super small, like a handful of people distributed around the world. So these are the teams that are going to be stretched thin or even thinner and will struggle. And it's going to have a cascading effect because some of these tools get reused. Like I just mentioned that the open source source libraries get reused by large software manufacturers.
What about red teams? How do you think they could benefit from the technology or technology like Mythos?
I think I should start by differentiating red teams from penetration testing teams, right? And in my mind, there are two different things. The penetration testing teams they're testing very specific things, and I'm going to call them a more focused, less intense kind of assessment. A true red team is the one that legitimately thinks like an adversary and uses adversarial tools, or uses tools the way an adversary would to try to accomplish an objective in your system. So real red teams are going to benefit tremendously because good red teams go as far as developing their own malware, in a sense, to show proof of concept malware that shows that not only can they get to a certain place in your system, they can actually cause a specific effect. They're going to be able to do this a lot quicker with a tool like Mythos that allows them to create a proof of concept exploit for a vulnerability. So is this would have taken them weeks to do? Now they can do it in potentially hours or perhaps days, and they're going to be able to do more of it. So if your organization can afford a real red team, that red team is going to be able to do way more than it used to.
Interesting. Let's switch it up. What about all the defenders out there? Will they be able to utilize it as much?
The defenders will be able to find vulnerabilities faster, but as I explained earlier, they still have to validate that the vulnerability is something that we care about. And then furthermore, they have to patch it. As they exist today, I'm going to guess that they're going to struggle a little bit until they adjust to how to better use automation and AI to enable this chain, this discovery, validation, patching chain that I mentioned earlier. I suspect that in the near term, the blue teams are going to be swamped with work.
It's interesting. Every technology I hear about is kind of helping red teams utilize certain things, but it's making every defender's life more and more complicated. Why is that? I need a tool that helps defender breathe.
Well, that's the thing. AI works both ways, right? The defenders, the blue team, we just talked about, right? They're going to be swamped. I just said that. As they learn to use automation and artificial intelligence more effectively for that particular purpose, be able to take advantage of the same capability that the adversary is taking advantage of, but in a different way. So I think you mentioned earlier the human validation of the vulnerabilities. And yes, that's the way that most organizations do it today. But that doesn't mean we cannot develop a model that will validate vulnerabilities for us. Actually existing models can do that. We just have to repurpose them. And then the patch development is something that AI models can also help with. It's just applying the tools we have in the right places. And then as the tools evolve and we get new tools, staying curious and staying resourceful and learning to plug those new tools or those new capabilities into the right places. And if your organization is agile and is not afraid of these tools, and importantly, is allowed to use them because, again, this is a regulatory issue and in some places a legal issue. I think it's going to be adversaries get a little bit ahead and then we get a little bit ahead and then back and forth, just like it always has been. But my concern is for those who cannot use artificial intelligence methods to stay at the same pace as the adversaries are.
Interesting. I think that's a nice way to put it. I have a few more questions for you. What's one thing people are getting completely wrong about Mythos?
I would say that it's not going to end the world. And it's importantly to us, it doesn't change the rules of the road. We have best practices in place for a reason. There are a lot of good programs out there that are going to fare just fine. Mythos is making a huge change in terms of speed, but not in terms of the core principles by which we develop and maintain security in our systems. If the adversaries gain speed, we need to figure out how to gain speed too. It doesn't mean we throw away the principles that we have been using successfully for a very long time.
Okay. Do you think Mythos is a turning point for cybersecurity, or do you think we're giving it more attention than it actually deserves?
There's a lot of news articles out there about how this is a game changer, a moment that the world can potentially collapse collapse. The financial system can collapse globally because of a tool like Mythos. Not really. I mean, what it's doing is accelerating an issue. It is not creating a new issue. So in my mind, all we have to do is keep up.
Yeah.
The place where we need to pay more attention to it is in this concept of where does it inject speed? Where does it accelerate things? And where does it not? And that is an important distinction because we need to counterbalance what adversaries might use this tool for. And the only way to do that is by us injecting speed, accelerating the right parts of our vulnerability management system programs.
Interesting. I think I like this perspective because I do agree with you. It's been given too much attention for the wrong reasons, I believe. But the media is what it is. We can't control that. I have two final questions for you. So before I end it, if you could leave our listeners with one message about Mythos, what would it be?
I think the message would be broader than Mythos, and it is be curious. Find out, learn about the things that you hear in the media. Don't just take an article at face value. Research it a little bit, and you don't have to be a sophisticated researcher. Just ask questions. Does everybody agree with this perspective? AI tools can help you even do the research. But if you peel back the layers a little bit, you'll find out that, I mean, let's face it, media companies have to sell, have to get our attention. That's why they have headlines that are like very, very compelling. Oh, I have to click on that link because the headline, it says the world is going to end tomorrow because of this thing called Mythos. But if you do a little bit of research, you realize, oh, wait, no, they just wanted me to click on the link. And they have to do that. It's a business. I get that. It's not they're being bad or anything. But if we stay informed, if we stay curious and we learn continuously about this evolving technology, we're going to be able to put it in the right context. We're going to understand what it truly does to our way of life and what it doesn't do. And we can separate the hype from the actual facts.
Nice advice. I like it. And I'll go by it because sometimes I do click on things and believe it without giving it the right context.
We all do.
One final thing. If you could name me a guest that you would like to see on the Cyber Pulse podcast and a topic that you'd like that guest to discuss, who would that guest to be and what would be the topic?
Ooh, that's a good one. There are so many people that come to mind. I would have to say that one of them would be one of my former bosses, General Keith Alexander, who was the head of the NSA and commander at U.S. Cyber Command. And the reason I mentioned that is because he experienced this both on the military side and the commercial side as well. Mm-hmm. So he has a very interesting perspective on how cyberspace affects all of us and what we all should be doing together collectively to defend. So that would be a person that jumps to mind. And I periodically reach out to him for advice. So yeah, that would be one person. I can probably come up with a long list, but here on the spot, that would be the first person that comes to mind.
Interesting. Let's see if I can actually catch him. Thank you, Fernando. This has been an interesting discussion. So thank you for your time and thank you for doing this. Any last words before I actually end it?
Yes. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share this interesting topic with you and with your listeners and keep doing what you're doing. We have to get the word out that we should all come together to discuss and then address important issues of our times that affect all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was definitely an interesting discussion. Thank you, Fernando, for doing this. Thank you for taking the time to join me and for sharing your thoughts on Anthropic Mythos. It's clear that this isn't just another AI announcement. Whether people see it as an opportunity, a challenge, or a bit of both, it's already starting important conversations about the future of vulnerability discovery, application security, and cyber defense. To everyone listening, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Cyber Pulse. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Do you think AI systems like Mythos will transform cybersecurity for the better, or do you think the risks outweigh the benefits? Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and as always, stay secure.